Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting a field mouse on top of a mushroom and I'm going to try to paint it in a loose manner. Let's begin by sketching out the outline, and on the bottom left corner is the reference image that I used, but I'm going to change the mushroom color to red just so the color will pop out a bit more. I'm not good with animal painting, so I tried to imagine the different sections in my head from what I see in the reference. I'm just going to separate the body and the head, then I'm going to connect the two shapes together. I know that this is not overly accurate, but I just tried to get the basic idea across. And of course, as I'm sketching, I try to sketch as light as possible so I don't dig into the paper with my pencil, and this way I can erase it and move the lines easily. Once I'm happy with the position of the mouse within the frame that I have, and I'm also okay with the shape of the body and such, that's when I'll start adding the smaller details like the ear, nose, and the eye, also the little feet. And once I'm done, I'm going to roughly draw out the mushroom. Again, the mushroom doesn't have to be accurate. You can even change the growth stage or even the type of mushroom. For the mushroom, I'm just going to draw out the basic outline without going into too much detail. I'm just going to freehand paint them later on. And for those of you who want to paint along but want to skip the drawing process, I'll have the outline available in my coffee shop. I quite like the idea of adding smaller mushrooms underneath this larger one, so I'm just going to add a couple like in the reference image, but I'm going to place them closer together to the main mushroom. I think this is enough guide for me, so next let's go over the colors. Firstly, this is Crimson Lake by Holbein, Vermilion by Holbein, New Gamboge by Daniel Smith, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Burnt Umber by Holbein, Payne's Grey Bluish by Schmincke, Terre Verte by Holbein, Shone Brilliant Dark by Holbein, and Bulletproof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. I'm also going to add little outlines and details using my watercolor colored pencil. You can also use regular colored pencil. Mine is by Faber Castell and it's just a hobby grade, so there are no specific colors, it's just the number if you have the exact same brand. And I'm also going to be using my masking fluid. This is by Maurice. And I really like this brand because the texture is quite light and easy to apply. Before I start to paint, I'm going to mask off the white parts of the mushroom, just so it's easier to avoid as I paint the cap later on. For this, I'm just kind of making up the placement, not really following the reference, but I like to play with the shapes and the size as well as the clusters to make these white scales as natural as possible. I also masked off the tail of the mouse since it's running across the cap, so I can easily paint over it later on. Though the tip of the bottle for the masking fluid is quite small, I still prefer to apply the masking fluid using my silicone brush because this silicone brush is very pointy and I can make really small shapes or even dots. And the edges of these shapes won't just be rounded, but I can play with thin edges or sharp edges as well. That's all I'm going to mask off, and I left it to dry. As you can see, the color is different. Now I'm ready to paint. I start out by painting the background. I first just use a wet brush so I can work or paint on this evenly dampened surface. And I'm going to create a bokeh effect. I first use this mixture of an earthy yellow-green from Terre Verte and yellow ochre, and I'm using a light to medium consistency to paint on circles and dots in different sizes, leaving little spaces in between these circles and letting the paint spread and touch on its own. As the surface starts to dry, I like to add on different shades of green. Here I've mixed Terre Verte and Payne's Grey Bluish for a dark green, but again I'm still using a fairly light consistency because I don't want the background to overpower the main subject. With this dark green, I try to paint them in between the lighter greens, And I just used these two colors as well as the tones in between them by mixing the two colors together to fill in the rest of the space. But I do want the edges of the background to be much lighter. I don't want the circles to stuck up on top of one another, so the placing looks a bit more organic. Sometimes I like to also add loose circles so it looks like the background is slowly dissipating into the white of the paper. Though I have good coverage for now, I still feel like I can redefine some of those circles if those circles blend into each other a bit too much. And I'm doing this still on the damp surface, and I'm also trying to clean up edges as best as I can. Sometimes I like to paint more circles on top of the lighter ones, or in this case, I like to also create outlines, redefining some of the circles that I've already painted. And if the surface is already dry and the outlines look a bit too defined, I'll just soften it with a clean damp brush to blur everything out. Once I'm done, I'm going to move on to the bottom, starting by dampening the surface, just like the background. I'm going to start with the leaves, and for this I'm using more or less the same green, but this time because the leaves from the reference are yellow and I quite like it that way. This time I decided to add new gamboge into the mixture. I'm using a medium consistency here, and I'm painting right in the middle instead of right to the edges because the paint will spread out. Now for these edges, I'm going to add on a little bit of vermilion into the same mixture to add some dry edges. Then in between these leaves, I'm going to use a thick consistency of more or less the same mixture, but with a bit more green in the ratio. I'm also going to add a bit of burnt umber into the green, and this will just create some variations. After this, I'm going to paint the stem of the mushroom, and here I have a mix of burnt umber with Payne's Grey Bluish and also some Jaune Brilliant Dark in a really light consistency. I just covered the stem very lightly, then I'm going to dampen the surface of the cap of the mushroom. Then on this damp surface, I'm just going to use some vermilion to cover the space. While the surface is still damp, I'm going to add the darker red. I added Crimson Lake into the vermilion, and I also added some burnt umber. Here I'm using a really thick consistency, but as it dries, because the surface is damp, the paint will spread out a little bit more and it'll also dilute down, so the color will still dry quite light. Once I've covered the whole cap, I'm going to leave it to dry, then move on to paint the caps of the smaller mushrooms. For this, I'm using the same mix, but I added more burnt umber into the mix, so this is more of a reddish brown now, and at the bottom I'm going to follow it up with yellow ochre. The next thing I'm going to paint is the mouse, but because the mouse is directly on top of the mushroom cap, I want to make sure everything is completely dry. I just use a hairdryer to make the process quick. Then for the light part of the mouse, I used the previous mushroom mixture, but I added a little bit of yellow ochre in the mix using a light consistency. Then for the darker areas, I just added burnt umber to the same mix, but this time I use a thicker consistency. I try to blend it as best as I can, but since I'm just using the back of a Canson XL paper, it was a little bit difficult to blend. But anyway, moving on, I just pulled the rest of the paint towards the face so it's a little bit lighter. Then for the nose, I just use a really light red. Here I'm just trying to blend the colors a little bit better by going back with the yellow ochre mix. And here I'm using a slightly thicker consistency to separate the body and the head. I try to create a better interaction between the mouse and this mushroom cap by creating a shadow directly underneath the mouse. And for this, I just used the same red as the mushroom cap, but I added some burnt umber into it. Then I'm going to go back to paint the mushroom cap to increase the saturation, I want to vary the color slightly and also make it look textured, which is why I'm doing this dotting motion. And I'm also leaving parts lighter than others. At the bottom here, I tried to darken it, and to darken the red, I just added more burnt umber and also crimson lake in the mix. So here I'm just going to slowly build on the saturation little by little. The paint will always dry lighter than what I've applied, so sometimes I like to wait for it to dry before applying a new layer. For the darkest part of the cast shadow right underneath the mouse, I want to really increase the value. So for the mixture, I use a lot of Vermilion Paints Gray Bluish and also burnt umber in a thick consistency. I'm treating the mouse the same way. I tried to increase the saturation little by little. Then for the shadow here, I use a darker brown. I also tried to create this little oval at the bottom for the thigh of the mouse, but I just made it as subtle as possible. This is also where I'll go back in to paint and redefine some of the finer details like the eyes and the ears. I tried to leave a little bit of white space from the base color. Then I'm just going to leave it to dry and move on to the stem of the mushroom. I'm going to use the same color as before, and that's from Paints Gray Bluish, burnt umber, and a bit of Jaune Brilliant Dark. And this time I'm using a slightly thicker consistency compared to the base. On the right hand side, you can see that the light is hitting from the reference image, so I'm just going to pull the paint with a clean damp brush. I'm going to do the same thing for the ring of the mushroom, but I've left out a little bit of white space in between the ring and the stem. I'm going to darken the area directly under the mushroom. For those areas though, I decided to add some yellow ochre and more burnt umber to warm up the tone of the shadow. For the line texture on the ring and the stem, I'm using the exact same color mixture but in a very light consistency, and I also use a really light load to almost dry brush so I can control the flow. Now going back to the smaller mushrooms, I'm just going to increase the saturation, and you can see from the reference that the sides are lighter. So as I'm building up the color, I'm going to increase the value by using a thicker consistency from the top center. Now I'm going to go back to the bottom of the painting. I'm going to redefine the things that I've already painted since everything just blended into each other. So now I'm going to work on the dry surface directly. This way the edges that I create will be nice and sharp. I'm just going to use the same colors as before for the leaves, using browns for the edges, and then I'm going to add yellows for the center of the leaves. Then for the moss, I'm going to use an earthy yellow-green mixture and a light load to create some pointy leaf textures. I'm just trying to establish the edges directly underneath the mushrooms, which are interacting with the smaller mushrooms and the larger one. Then at the bottom, I'm going to lessen the amount of detail. So I like to use a mix of a darker green and the same yellow green. I like to paint similar textures but with less detail, and at the end I also smudge some parts of it so it looks kind of messy and blurry, and it doesn't take away from the details that we've added around the edges. Once I'm done, I want to make sure everything's completely dry so I don't accidentally rip the paper as I'm taking off the masking fluid. Once everything is unmasked, I'm going to start with the tail of the mouse because it's very long and fine and I don't want to accidentally paint on it as I'm painting the mushroom cap. And once it's done, I'm going to move on to the dark part of the mushroom, which is at the bottom. I used a mix of Vermilion, Crimson Lake, and Burnt Umber, painting the bottom of the cap, and I don't mind going over some of the white areas because those areas should also be in shadow, and because it was white underneath and watercolor is transparent, it's not going to look as dark, or it's not going to have a similar tone to the red areas. Now, using the same color in a really light consistency in painting the middle parts or just some random parts within those scales, just so it doesn't look completely flat, then I'm going to use a thicker consistency of the same color to paint underneath it to make those scales look a bit more three-dimensional. Now that I've painted the mushroom, I feel like I need to adjust the background. I'm going to darken and increase the saturation of the bouquet background. This is to increase the contrast against the light stems of the mushrooms so they can stand out a bit more. I don't want the top of the background to be too dark, so I'm just going to soften the blend to the lighter background as I reach the top. My camera wasn't recording, but I just added the eyes for the mouse, and this is from a mix of Burnt Umber and Payne's Grey Bluish in a very thick consistency. Then I'm going to continue with my colored pencil since I feel like I have enough for the base color. I feel like it's much easier to create the fur texture with the colored pencil, and I also like the additional scratchy line textures from the pencil itself. As I'm drawing on the fur, I like to follow the roundness of the mouse. This just adds volume so it doesn't look flat, instead it looks a little bit chubby. And you can see the direction of those lines following the curvatures. I feel like the scales on the mushrooms are a bit too chunky, so I'm going to use a thick consistency of bleed-proof white to just add smaller ones, and I'm also going to use the bleed-proof white to add some really fine whiskers. I feel like I'm basically done after this. I'm just going to do some final adjustments if I want to increase the saturation of certain things and also add some more textures. I feel like the bottom of the mushroom looks a little bit too rounded, so it's making the perspective a little bit off, as if the mushroom is tilting towards us. So I'm just going to flatten it by adding more of the dark red underneath on a straighter line, and I added the extra bleed-proof white on top. Lastly, I'm going to add outlines and textures to the stem of the mushrooms, and that's basically it. And that's basically it for this painting. I'm fairly happy with how this turned out. I would prefer to do this on proper paper though, instead of the back of a Canson XL, but I'm pretty happy with the feel and the atmosphere of the painting. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please consider subscribing for more. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!